Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Gabriel Goulis, and I'm here with, and we are presenting our patch note predictor, which uses natural language processing. Um, so jumping straight into it, the motivation behind our project. Um, League of Legends is a very complicated game, and naturally balancing a game like this is next to impossible. Some points of balance here that we listed are game items, the runes in the game, which affect just base stats that the champion might have, and also their play style, the physical champions in the game or the characters, the jungle camps, which are just prevalent throughout the prevalent in the game. It's just something that you can kill in the game and gain XP and gold from. So just think of it as another objective in the game, and then actual physical structures. And kind of the list goes on, especially since they continuously add new content to the game. Um, our idea was to take a pretty novel approach of just taking something called a patch, taking the relevant data here for us is going to be, it's highlighted in red. So the structure of a patch, this is just a high level overview of what the patch would look like. Think of this as a summary, but the physical patch is right here. So this is just one example of a champion change. So as we can see over here, Azir got adjusted, and in the red is what we're actually grabbing. This is the changes that happen to Azir's, in particular his W ability. And some other relevant data that we need is the physical win rate of the champion in each of its games. And we take this over time, and we're kind of mapping this from the change from the previous patch to the new patch and how that's affecting their win rate in relation to the physical changes that happen in the patch. So the methodology we use to actually gain this data or gather this data, considering it's not readily available, we need to procure it on our own. So on the left here, we have the structure of the win rate data that we collected. And this is just a list of lists where each inner list item has the epoch time, which just equates to the date that the data was collected, and the win rate at that current time for the champion. And this is a list that's going to be like nearly 100 items long for every champion, and there's almost 100 and upwards of 150 champions in the game. And so this is what we just gathered this manually. And then on the right here, we actually scraped this data. This is the physical changes that happen in each patch. And I made a scraper to gather um, all the relevant data for every champion and the change that happened in the patch. And then we also mapped the data previously gathered manually. We mapped it to a delta change in win rate, which is just the previous patch before the change, and then the current patch's win rate. So the previous patch minus the current patch is, or the current patch minus the previous patch equates to the delta change in win rate. And then obviously the changes physically under it. And this is just a list of objects of this form. This is what we ended up scraping. And these were the actual, this is actually the structure that was fed to our model um, to, kind of predict what changes will result in what kind of, or what changes will affect what kind of change or delta change in win rate. So a couple of things that we had to do before actually feeding this data to the model. First and foremost, we had to understand which data we were actually going to gather. So a couple of things we had to omit were changes during preseason, which are changes that are kind of made to shake up the meta. So these changes aren't really relevant to the physical win rates of the champions because they're kind of can be considered edge cases. Since they're changing the meta so much, the actual gathering of the win rate during these preseasons isn't really relevant to the win rate that's occurring over the regular seasons. In addition to that, so we can't calculate the delta value from the changes during preseason. In addition to that, we need to remove patch changes that cannot be scraped properly. So these include changes to the win rate, but there actually isn't any like patch relevant for these changes to the win rate. So we need to omit like all these data points that we gather for win rates whenever there isn't physical changes in the patch. And then we also need to normalize these delta values. So moving on to our model architecture.
So for the model, we chose a security model with dimension 8 because that's the most like the dimension that I think is the most is enough for the natural language processing, and we choose a large LSTM with a unit 32. We also tokenize the text from the patch in the patch notes in the individual tag for the natural language processing, so that we can feed those tokens into each different layer of this sequence and compare it to the win rate, the delta that is also feeding into the model to get a sentiment analysis of the delta of the win rate, which we normalize between one, that is one, which is we consider as above, or zero, which considers an absolute nerve. So for the results, at the end of the results, the model loss will end of the processing of the model. The model loss will be around 0.13, and we consider model accuracy will be around 0.949394. So as an example, over here we put a new type of base gas or base health decrease from 610 to 400, and to the model, which is considered as for another example, like the magic damage, the base stat for the magic damage is increased by 10 by a flat 10. And then for the model, it's considered as an absolute loss.
Some challenges with creating our model and some areas of improvement. So first and foremost, we both think that there's additional context in the patch notes that could have been taken into account when creating our model or creating the training data for the model. Previously in the slides, you saw that not only were there the changes highlighted in red, but there's actually a paragraph before every change is made where the people that create the patches are kind of explaining where they're coming from whenever making a change to the champion. And we think that there's a lot of context in these summaries that could possibly be applied to the model. In addition, previously you saw that there was that short graphical representation of the patch summary and the changes that are made. And we think that there's a definitely possibility here for us to take like a unique approach of kind of graphically analyzing these patch summaries, these pictures, and then trying to make sentiment analysis based off that. In addition to this, there's some kind of minor flaws with the scheme we use for data collection. The inability to contact the parent company owning League of Legends, who actually formally collects all of this data, and having to, kind of string together data from multiple sources and websites that are independent, kind of made it a really significant challenge actually to, accurately gather our data and calculate these delta values, especially considering the fact that the data ranges back all the way to 2014. I think there's definitely, again, additional cleaning on the patch data that can be done, including things like adjustments that you saw in the example earlier, considering the fact that adjustments aren't necessarily a very clear buff or nerf. They just adjust the way the champions played. And so, analyzing the sentiment there isn't really relevant. And then again, there's a couple of minor flaws behind the methodology that we use to collect the data, considering the fact that, although champions might be changed in a patch and they might be intended to be buffs or nerfs by the patch notes, it doesn't necessarily mean that it'll have that specific effect on the win rate of the champion, and that it can actually have an opposite effect. Considering like an example, if one champion is buffed, like the damage is buffed 10%, but every other champion that patch is buffed, the damage is buffed 20%, then the win rate of that champion that is only buffed 10% is going to suffer, even though it's technically a buff based off sentiment analysis. And so the inability to gather and kind of bring together, a more broad, scheme of data and additional context like this kind of allowed our model to suffer. And so an example here, there's edge cases where, um, like for example, this is one edge case where there's probably not a lot of instances in the patches of bonus movement speed scaling being changed. And so whenever there's a change like this being occurred or some kind of unique change on a stat or ability that hasn't seen before, it gets confused and it's going to consider this as a nerf when in reality, depending on the circumstances, like in the early ranks of the spell, it's actually getting a buff, but or it's actually getting a nerf, but in the later ranks, it's getting a buff. And so, the inability to bring in additional context, like I was mentioning earlier, is definitely allowing our model to suffer.
The natural language processing of the patch was having a really, really new era to explore. We didn't really touch on it before this. We understand between the natural language processing and sequential model had led to some more cohesion between the pattern and the wing delta. We could continue to test the model. We are the right development team for better insight on tactical decision and the data gathering.
All right. I think in general, our approach was right in principle. But as stated earlier, additional context and other approaches could definitely be made to further this cause. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation and have a great day.
Thank you.